At the dinner, marking 10 years since my husband passed, my son stood up and said he wanted his children to call his mother-in-law Mum from now on. I sat there holding my breath, while everyone else nodded. 10 years of keeping this family together, and in one toast, I was erased. But I didn't cry. I went home, opened the drawer he never touched, and found the first clue of something darker. They thought they had replaced me quietly. They had no idea what I still held in my hands. The restaurant smelled like rosemary and warm bread. Minnetonka Bistro had been my husband's favorite. For 10 years, I'd come here on the anniversary of his passing. This year, my son Graham and his family insisted on joining. I had hoped it was a gesture of remembrance. I had hoped wrong. We were seated at the corner table near the window, the same one Albert and I used to sit at. I wore the navy scarf he gave me on our 30th anniversary. Graham raised his glass first. I thought he might say something about his father. He smiled at me, then turned to his children and said, "From today on, I think it's time you start calling Nana Celine Mum, too. She's done so much for this family." There was a pause. Celine gave me a polite smile. She looked like she had rehearsed it. I held my breath, but no one noticed. Not even my grandkids looked confused. They just nodded and smiled, like it had been settled, like I was just another guest at the table. 10 years. 10 years I'd carried this family, walked through grief while keeping Sunday dinners going, picking up the kids from school when they were sick, holding everything together while Celine traveled and Graham worked late. And now I was being thanked with a quiet replacement. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My hands were shaking under the table. I reached for my water to hide it, but it was too late. I had already heard what I needed. After the plates were cleared and dessert came, Graham started talking about family traditions. He spoke of new routines with Celine's side of the family, how they wanted to rotate holidays. I realized they had already planned it. My name wasn't part of any of it. As we left the restaurant, Celine touched my arm gently. She said she hoped I wasn't offended, that the kids needed more than one grandmother these days. Her voice was sweet, too sweet. I nodded. I smiled. But inside something settled. Not anger. Not yet. Just a heaviness. A quiet awareness that something had shifted. And I was no longer at the center. You ever feel it? That moment you realize you're no longer needed, not even missed. That your seat at the table is still warm, but someone else's name is on the place card. That night when I got home, I didn't cry. I just sat in the dark with Albert's old scarf in my lap. I whispered a single sentence out loud, and it echoed louder than any argument I could have had. They erased me, and they did it with a smile. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't slept much, only drifted in and out. The house was quiet, but it felt different, like it belonged to someone else now. I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching the countertop Albert built with his own hands. It still had the tiny scratch where Graham had dragged a chair across it when he was 6. That scratch used to make me smile. Now it just felt like a relic from a different life. I opened the fridge and paused. The shelves were neatly organized, almost too tidy. Several containers had masking tape with Celine's handwriting labels, like quinoa salad, chia pudding, and organic bone broth. She never used to bring food over. Now it filled my fridge. I stepped back and opened the pantry. The same pattern. Rows of supplements, sugar-free snacks, imported teas. Not my brands, not my taste, not mine. I walked into the living room and stood still. The family photo wall had changed. I always kept it simple photos of Graham growing up our wedding day, Albert holding our first grandson. But now 3 new frames were added. Studio portraits of Celine's mother with the kids all matching sweaters, smiling wide. One of my wedding photos had been moved to the bottom shelf. Another was gone entirely. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wandered to the hallway closet. My old coats were stacked beneath a new box marked Donate, Pick Up Friday. I hadn't put that there. My wool coat, the one I wore the night Albert proposed, was in that box. I pulled it out, brushing off the tag that had already been attached to it. I headed to the guest room, now mostly used by the kids during sleepovers. On the desk sat a new photo album, leather-bound and gold-edged. I opened it. Page after page, glossy images of Graham's family vacations, school events, birthday parties. Celine's family was in nearly every frame. Her mother, her sisters, even a cousin I didn't recognize. I kept flipping, searching for something. Anything. But not a single photo of me. Not one. I sank into the edge of the bed, holding the album. It felt like I was holding proof. Proof that somewhere along the way I had been edited out. Quietly. Systematically. I didn't shout. I didn't sob. But something inside me collapsed. This wasn't about one night at dinner. This had been building slowly like a leak behind a wall. Small things, a missing coffee mug, a rearranged drawer, a birthday card never sent. And now this. They hadn't told me I was no longer part of the center. They just reshaped the center until I didn't fit in it anymore. I looked around the room and realized how little of me remained, and how much of someone else had taken root. It was still my house, but not my home. Not anymore. 2 weeks later, I received a call from First Shore Bank. The woman on the other end sounded polite but hesitant. She was confirming a transfer from one of the household accounts. "It matches previous activity," she said, "but we just wanted to confirm it with you directly." I hadn't authorized any transfers. I asked her to hold while I fetched my ledger. I kept everything handwritten. Albert used to tease me for being old-fashioned, but it helped me sleep at night. When I came back and compared the numbers, my heart sank. 2 transfers, 15,000 each. One went to an investment fund I had never heard of, the other to a personal checking account I didn't recognize. I asked her when these transfers started. Her answer chilled me. 4 months ago, monthly. I hung up and sat still in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the fridge. 4 months. That was around the same time. Graham insisted on simplifying our household finances, said he'd help automate the bills, streamline the accounts. He called it taking the burden off my plate. I had been recovering from a fall at the time, still foggy from the medication. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the guest room. The key was still taped under the drawer like Albert taught me. Inside, folders lined up in perfect order. I pulled out the bank file, opened the recent statements, and found the digital signature authorizations. Except I never signed anything online. Page after page, my name appeared. But it wasn't my signature. Not exactly. The stroke was too fluid. No hesitation in the B, no skip on the loop in the E, like my hand usually made. I opened another drawer and pulled out the envelope marked legal. Inside, I kept old tax documents, property deeds, and the power of attorney forms Albert and I had signed when Graham was first heading to college, just in case anything happened while he was away. It had long since expired. But now a fresh form had been added. Recent, filed and notarized. I flipped to the last page. There was my signature again. Only I never signed it. My pulse pounded in my ears. The date on the signature matched the week I was discharged from rehab after surgery. I barely remembered those first few days home. Graham had stayed with me, made sure I took my pills, handled my meals. He said he would take care of everything. He was gentle, patient, just like a good son. But he must have put that paper in front of me when I was still too groggy to question anything. I placed the form down carefully. The air felt heavier. I wasn't just being replaced in photos or pushed out of dinner plans. I had been removed on paper. erased from decisions, quietly, legally. I walked out to the porch and sat on the bench Albert built. My hands trembled. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line, and for a brief second I could hear his voice, telling me to pay attention, to stay sharp. I had missed it, but I wasn't going to miss what came next. The next morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the blinds like nothing had changed. But everything had. I reached for the manila folder I'd pulled from my old filing cabinet. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside were legal papers I hadn't touched in years. My fingers trembled slightly as I leafed through the documents. When I came across the power of attorney form, I froze. The signature at the bottom was mine, at least it was supposed to be. But the loops were too smooth, the slant too sharp. It looked almost correct, but it wasn't. I'd signed enough documents in my life to know what my hand looked like. I flipped the page and found the notarization stamp. That was real. Dated during the week I was discharged from Fairview Medical Center, the same week I'd undergone knee surgery, and was heavily medicated on oxycodone. I closed my eyes and let the pieces settle into place. That was the week Graham had insisted on staying over, said he wanted to help me recover. He'd made me herbal tea every night, handled my mail, even brought in a notary to the house for something he said was routine estate housekeeping. I hadn't remembered clearly, until now. I remembered the pen in my hand. I remembered his voice, soft and persuasive. I remembered the numbness in my arms from the medication, and how I didn't want to read. "Just sign Mum," he said. "I'll take care of the rest." The bile rose in my throat. It wasn't just betrayal. It was manipulation in my weakest moment. He hadn't only taken my trust, he'd stolen my rights. I checked the attached clauses. This new document effectively nullified the older, more balanced power-sharing agreement I'd signed years ago with my late husband. The new version gave Graham sole authority over my financial decisions, including real estate transactions, banking access, and investment redirection, and I had unknowingly signed it. I stood from the table and braced myself on the counter. For a moment, I wasn't sure if it was anger or heartbreak holding me upright. All I knew was it had been done deliberately. I wasn't imagining it. I hadn't misunderstood. It was real. Later that afternoon, I pulled the older file cabinet out of the hallway closet. Hidden behind stacks of tax records was the original joint power of attorney from 2009. There in my husband's neat, firm handwriting was our shared intention. Both of us had to agree on any major decision. There had been balance, mutual respect, and it had been erased without a word. I took a breath, pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app. I began a list, not of names, but of dates. The week of my surgery, the date of the notarized forgery, the phone call from the bank. The first time I noticed my name was no longer listed on the cabin property tax form. Each thread led back to that week of weakness, and each thread led back to Graham. My hands didn't shake anymore. They moved quickly with clarity. I wasn't grieving a loss. I was documenting a theft. There was no screaming, no tears, just a slow burn of realization that would not go out. Graham hadn't just written me out of his life. He'd rewritten me out of my own. And if he could erase my name on paper, I would carve it back, inch by inch, where it belonged. I didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I kept pacing between the hallway and the study, pulling out drawers I hadn't touched in years. Most of the contents were what I expected: old birthday cards, utility bills, a faded manual for a blender that broke 10 years ago. But in the bottom drawer of my husband's old desk, tucked beneath a fraying blue scarf he used to wear in winter, I found a small leather-bound folder I'd never seen before. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was unmistakable Jacob's. My chest tightened. His script always had a steadiness to it, even when his hands had started to shake in the last few months of his life. I hesitated, then broke the seal. The letter was short, just 1 page. He wrote it in the weeks before his last hospital stay. He said he'd been thinking a lot about the future, and that there were things he needed to say, even if they would be hard for me to read. He said he worried about Graham. Graham is clever, he wrote, and ambition is not a flaw, but he doesn't yet understand the weight of responsibility. He believes he can shape the world around him, but doesn't yet know that people are not pieces to be moved. My hands trembled, but I kept reading. Celine is charming, but I've watched how she looks at you, Bernice. There's no affection there, just calculation. I pray I'm wrong, but if I'm not, you'll need to stay alert. Not everyone who calls you family will protect you like families should. Then came the last paragraph. I've set up a contingency fund. Not much, but enough to give you control if ever things start to feel out of your hands. It's with the Wilburn Trust office. Talk to Nadine Park. She helped me draw up the paperwork. She'll know. I folded the letter and held it against my chest. That 1 page written in the last season of his life felt like an anchor in a sea I hadn't even realized I was drowning in. Jacob had seen it coming. Maybe not all of it, but enough to leave behind something more than words. A warning, a lifeline. I spent the rest of the morning searching the study, this time with fresh eyes. In a locked drawer of his file cabinet, I found a thick envelope labelled Wilburn Trust Documents. There was a copy of the trust agreement, a list of assets, and a note confirming my name as the sole beneficiary in case of incapacity or contested legal status. My heart steadied as I read. He hadn't just thought of me. He'd protected me. It all started to fit together. Graham must have known about the trust, or at least suspected. That's why he'd moved so fast after my surgery, forged the power of attorney redirected funds. He wanted to get ahead of anything that might delay his plans. But Jacob had already accounted for that. And now so would I. I made a list. The lawyer, the trust office, the backup documents. Everything I needed to verify what I had and what they had taken. My grief hadn't vanished. It sat in my chest like a heavy stone. But now it had direction. Now it had teeth. And for the first time since the night of that dinner, I felt the beginnings of something steadier than pain. Resolve. Looking back now, the signs had been there for years. They weren't loud. Graham never shouted, never slammed doors. His betrayal wasn't the kind that leaves bruises. It was the kind that smiled over morning coffee, listened politely to stories I'd told 100 times, then slowly erased me from the picture one decision at a time. After I found Jacob's letter and the trust documents, my eyes sharpened. Every past conversation replayed in my mind with new clarity. 4 years ago, Graham had come to me with a folder in hand. He said he was helping me get ahead of future paperwork. The folder contained forms, property titles, tax documents, banking authorizations. I'd signed most of them without reading closely. He'd made it sound so harmless, so responsible. Now I understood that was the first step. Back then, Celine had hovered nearby, always gracious, always helpful. She had a gift for knowing when to stay quiet and when to lean in. When I'd hesitated at the documents, she'd placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said I deserved rest, that I shouldn't burden myself with complicated things at my age. It had sounded like kindness. Now I saw it for what it was, distraction packaged in affection. Celine had always played the long game. Even when we first met, she'd been strategic. Never directly rude, but subtly reshaping our family traditions to suit her image. Christmas moved from my house to theirs. Recipes were updated. My garden gifts were replaced with store-bought centerpieces. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Women like her often wanted control of the domestic stage. But now I saw that every change chipped away at what I'd built. And Graham let her. Or maybe he liked it that way. The hardest part, though, was the children. My two grandkids used to run to me when they were little. I remembered their small hands in mine, the way they called me Grandma Bernie with bright voices. But over the past few years, they'd grown quieter around me. They started saying things like, Grandma Lissa says we shouldn't bother you too much. Or Mum says your stories are from the old times. Lissa Celine's mother, the one Graham now wanted them to call Mum. I realized those kids barely knew who I was anymore. They'd been raised with a different version of me, carefully curated and trimmed to the edges. To them, I was a holiday guest. Someone who sent cards and maybe smelled like lavender and old books. Not the woman who had once sung them lullabies or taught them to plant tomatoes. The truth settled heavy in my chest. It wasn't just my finances that had been taken. It was my presence, my voice, my identity. And it hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow process carried out with precision. I wasn't a victim of neglect. I was the product of a well-managed erasure. But I wasn't gone. Not yet. I started writing everything down: dates, memories, exact conversations I could recall. I made copies of every legal document Jacob had left. I scanned everything Graham had me sign. I began building a timeline. I wasn't sure yet what would come next. But I knew one thing. They had underestimated the wrong woman. The cabin at Baxter Hollow had always been mine. Jacob and I bought it the year Graham turned 12. It wasn't grand or flashy, just a simple wooden home with a wide porch, a fireplace that smoked too much, and windows that opened out to a still, glassy lake. That place had held our best summers, our quietest griefs, and most importantly, it was still under my name. I packed light. Just a suitcase, the trust documents, Jacob's letter, and every photocopy I'd made over the last week. I didn't tell Graham I was leaving. I didn't leave a note. I needed to be where no one looked over my shoulder, where the air was mine to breathe again. The drive north took 4 hours. Trees lined the roadside, already tinged with gold. Autumn was rolling in fast. When I stepped onto the porch of the cabin, it was as if time cracked open. The floorboards creaked the same way. The air smelled of pine and ash. I set my suitcase down, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel watched. I spent the next few days in quiet motion. I laid out every document across the old dining table. I sorted dates, highlighted transactions, printed emails from the bank. I created folders for every year Graham had slowly rewritten my legal standing. By the end of the 3rd day, I had something close to a map of my own erasure. I also had visitors, not people, realtors. The first one came in a blue windbreaker, clipboard in hand. He asked if this was still the B. Ellison property and whether I was ready to show the inside. I told him to leave. The second one, a woman with perfect teeth, said she had a standing appointment with my son's office to take photos next week. That's when my hands began to tremble. I called the county office. The clerk was confused when I asked if the property had been listed for sale. She confirmed it was not on the market. But she paused, then added that someone had inquired about a power of attorney document connected to the property's deed just last month. Graham. It had to be. He wasn't content with the house, the accounts, the titles. He wanted to sell the cabin too, my last untouched place. And he was doing it behind my back, just like everything else. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about removing the last trace of me. That night I sat by the fireplace Jacob built and stared at the flames until my coffee went cold. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been too simple. What I felt was colder than that. A precise, heavy certainty that I needed to act before everything I'd built was rewritten by someone else's pen. This cabin was my line in the sand. In the morning, I would call someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Her name was Nadine Park. She'd been Jacob's legal advisor during the trust's formation, and the only lawyer I'd ever seen make my husband flinch in respect. I didn't know if she still practiced, but I knew if there was one person who could help me bring this story back into the light, it was her. Because this was no longer about saving memories. It was about reclaiming proof that I had ever existed in this family at all. I found Nadine's number the old-fashioned way, in the back of Jacob's leather address book, scribbled in his blocky handwriting with a star beside her name. I wasn't sure she'd remember me. I wasn't even sure she was still practicing. But I dialed anyway, hands steady, even as my stomach turned. A younger voice picked up first. I asked for Nadine. There was a pause. Then, in a voice as firm and unshaken as I remembered, she came on the line. I said my name, told her I was Jacob Ellison's widow. There was a silence on her end. Not cold, not surprised, just still. Then she said simply she'd been expecting a call like this for years. We met the next morning in a modest office suite on the east side of St. Paul. She hadn't changed much. Her hair was whiter, her clothes more relaxed, but her eyes were just as sharp. She took one look at the folder I handed her and began flipping through without a word. Bank statements, transaction trails, the forged power of attorney. Jacob's letter. Her fingers paused on that page. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured. She said the document Graham submitted was invalid on multiple grounds. First, it was dated during my hospital recovery, which disqualified my ability to sign under full capacity. Second, the signature was off. Not enough for a layperson to notice, but she spotted it immediately. And third, the notary listed on the form had retired 4 years prior. She said what Graham did wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. There was no pity there, just focus. She began outlining steps. First, we'd file to freeze the transfer of any assets tied to the forged authority. Then we'd contact the Trust's Oversight Committee to flag discrepancies. Finally, we'd file for reinstatement of full asset control under my name, citing elder fraud and abuse. I nodded, not because I understood every term, but because I trusted her. Over the next few days, Nadine and I worked like quiet machines. She drafted letters. I compiled lists of every purchase Graham had made in the past year using my accounts. We tracked where Celine's interior design business had drawn funds. We flagged inconsistencies. We found backdated emails between Graham and a bank officer that hinted at coercion. By the 4th day, we had enough for an emergency injunction. I signed everything in blue ink. Nadine said it was always better than black when filing fraud cases. It showed clarity, decisiveness, presence. I didn't argue. She was the kind of woman who'd seen hundreds of families break apart over less. She once told Jacob during an estate consultation that paper cut deeper than knives. On the 5th day, she submitted the paperwork. A temporary freeze was approved within 48 hours. Graham wouldn't be able to access the main accounts. Celine's side withdrawals were now flagged for audit. And the sale inquiry on the cabin had been voided pending ownership review. It was a small pause in the storm, but I felt it. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one running to catch up. I had taken the first real step toward undoing what had been done to me in the shadows. Before I left her office, Nadine placed her hand over mine. She said there would be consequences. Graham would retaliate. He might try to spin the story, blame me, isolate me further. But she also said something I held close for the rest of that week. She said the law remembers even when families forget. And that was enough to keep me moving forward. I waited until Graham and Celine left for their out-of-town conference. I knew their schedule better than they realized. They'd be gone for 3 days, staying at some retreat center that Celine's new client had sponsored. That gave me time to move in silence. I used the spare key Graham had long forgotten I still had. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Not like it used to be when the kids were young and the sound of their bare feet echoed on the hardwood. I stood in the front hallway for a long moment, taking in what used to be my home. The floral runner I had picked out was gone, replaced by something grey and minimalist. Even the light felt colder. I walked to the living room first. The large family portrait that once hung above the fireplace had been replaced with a new one, Graham, Celine, their kids, and Celine's mother, all smiling in some matching beige outfits. My face had been erased. My story cut out like an unwanted scene. I opened the storage closet, found the sealed plastic container I had tucked away years ago. Inside were the old frames, dusty but intact. I took them out one by one. Me. Holding Graham at the hospital, our first Christmas with Jacob, the boys running on the lawn. I wiped the glass clean with my sleeve and began returning them to their rightful places. In the kitchen, I reversed the changes that had quietly crept in. I put my copper kettle back on the stove, lined the countertop with the antique canisters Jacob's mother had passed down. I placed the porcelain rooster, the one Graham hated, right back on the windowsill. Every small act was deliberate, every item a statement. In the bedroom, I changed the bedspread, back to the navy quilted one I had sewn myself 20 years ago. Folded away the pale, impersonal bedding Celine had insisted on. I didn't touch any of her things, but I let them feel out of place. By the time I was done, the house no longer looked like theirs. It looked like memory, mine. I sat in the armchair by the front window and waited. They arrived just after dusk, rolling suitcases in tow. I watched their silhouettes through the frosted glass. They opened the door, chatting about the trip. And then they stopped. The silence that fell over the entryway was absolute. Graham's voice came first low and uncertain. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. I sat with the file box in my lap, hands folded neatly over it. Celine stepped in next. Her eyes flicked across the living room, widening as they saw the photos. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I let the silence stretch. Graham finally spoke something about how I couldn't just let myself in like that it was inappropriate. I met his eyes. Slowly, I stood holding the file box in front of me like a ledger of truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said the things in this box are going to decide what happens next. His face tightened. He looked at the box like it might explode. I walked past him, gently laid the box on the dining table and opened it. I didn't explain. I let the pages speak for themselves. The forged signature, the frozen accounts, the reversed transfers, the notarized affidavit from Nadine. They stood there, stunned, trying to process it all. I didn't need to watch them unravel. I had already done my part. Now it was time for them to sit with what they had done. And for once, I would be the one to leave on my own terms. I didn't need to explain the contents of the box. Every paper had weight. Every line said what I no longer had to. Graham stood still while Celine hovered near the edge of the dining table, her fingers twitching toward the documents but never quite touching them. I reached into the folder and slid one sheet forward. It was the certified bank transfer signed not by me, but with a signature close enough to fool someone at a glance. Graham's name appeared underneath. I tapped it once with my index finger, then looked at him. He didn't speak. His jaw locked tight. His hands hung stiff at his sides. Another paper. The financial power of attorney. Signed on a date I remembered clearly, the week I had been in recovery from a mild stroke. The week I had barely been able to write my own name. Celine took a shallow breath. Her eyes darted to Graham, waiting for him to take the lead. I turned the page again. This time it was the letter from Nadine on legal letterhead, confirming that the documents filed to change access to my accounts were invalid, and that a freeze had already been placed pending further action. They couldn't say they hadn't been warned. The consequences were already moving. I finally spoke my voice, even and quiet. I told them they didn't need to worry about removing me from the family, because I had already walked away from it. I said it not out of anger, not to make them flinch, but because it was true. I had spent months wrestling with that choice, mourning it in silence. Celine started to speak, her tone half curious, half defensive, but I cut through her noise with a single document, a list of discreet transfers she had made from Graham's business account to one held under her name. Smaller amounts buried in holiday expense reports, each one noted and logged. Her face went white, not because she thought it was illegal, but because she realized I knew. I said nothing else. I simply gathered the papers, returned them to the folder, and slid the box back under my arm. I walked toward the door without asking permission. This time I didn't pause to look back. The threshold no longer felt like a border between my past and theirs. It was simply a door, one I no longer needed to knock on. Outside, the air was brisk. The sun had begun to set. I could hear the faint sound of a dog barking in the next yard, children laughing far down the street. Life moved on, indifferent. I got in the car, hands steady on the wheel. No adrenaline, no fury, just clarity. For years I had tried to hold this family together with warmth and forgiveness. But sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to let it go. Not to fight loud or drag them into court, but to rise so fully into your own power that they have no choice but to face what they've done. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was building something bigger than their betrayal. I wasn't planning to destroy them. I just made sure they could no longer destroy me. That night I drove north, away from the house, toward Baxter Hollow, toward the cabin, toward the quiet, and toward the next step of my plan. The cabin smelled of cedar and thyme. I stood in the doorway, letting the familiar air settle around me like a worn shawl. Everything was just as I had left it. The lake, the trees, the stillness. It was the only place left untouched by their hands. I lit the small fireplace, not for warmth, but for grounding. I needed to begin the next part of my life with clarity. I had spent enough time reacting to what had been taken. Now it was time to decide what I would build. I sat at the table with the old manila envelope that had once belonged to my husband. It held the original paperwork for the trust he had started, but never finalized. It also held the last letter he wrote, the one I had read so many times. The folds had faded into the paper. He had trusted me to know when the moment came. I believed this was that moment. With Nadine's help, we reactivated the framework of the original trust. But this time, I didn't build it for myself alone. I created it as a foundation for women like me. Women pushed to the margins, silenced, dismissed, manipulated out of their own worth. Women who were told they were just someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. I named it the Hollow Light Fund, a place to restore dignity and offer legal aid counseling, temporary retreat housing. It wasn't a loud announcement. It was a quiet, resolute gesture, one that would outlast gossip family dinners and bank accounts. The cabin became more than a sanctuary. I had it renovated into a multi-purpose lodge, part legal resource hub, part place of rest. Volunteers came. Some were women I had met in waiting rooms. Some were referrals from Nadine's network. They brought stories, wounds, wisdom, and together we built something that pulsed with calm strength. I never told Graham or Celine about it. I didn't need to. The point wasn't to prove anything to them. The point was to stop tying my value to whether they ever saw me again. I funded the trust with the money I had fought to recover, along with the annuities left in my name that they didn't know about. I added part of the rental income from the old storage facility I had co-owned with my sister in Iowa. Small streams became a strong river. I bought back time, not for regrets, but for intention. I started to wake up without dread. I stopped rehearsing old conversations in my head. I tended the gardens around the cabin. I cooked for women who hadn't eaten warm food in weeks. I sat with them in silence when words were too much. I watched them arrive hollowed out and leave with something in their eyes again. Not answers, just space. And sometimes space is the most powerful gift. One night, sitting by the dock, I reread the trust charter. The last paragraph bore my signature. I had crossed a line no one could pull me back from. I had not only survived what they did, I had named it. And then I had chosen what to do next. It wasn't about reclaiming the old life. That life was gone. It was about planting something in the ashes and watching it grow. The front porch light was still broken when Graham brought the kids to the house that Thanksgiving weekend. He carried a dusty wreath in one hand, a sack of groceries in the other. Celine followed a few steps behind, fussing with her scarf, pretending she didn't notice the silence that clung to the place. They hadn't been back since I left. Inside, the air was flat, not stale, just empty. No cinnamon simmering on the stove, no jazz playing low from the kitchen radio. The dining table stood bare, its wood stripped of polish. The couch was still there, but the throw blanket I used to fold each evening was gone. Everything looked smaller without me in it. Graham walked through the hallway slowly, as if expecting something to feel familiar. But there were no shoes by the door, no scent of lavender detergent from the laundry room, no hum of my voice filling the space. It wasn't a home anymore. It was just a structure built on what used to be shared. He found the letter I had left on the entry table. Handwritten, folded once, no envelope. It began with his name and ended without warmth. Do not call me mother. A mother teaches you how to care. I was that woman once, but I cannot be her anymore. Take care of your children. Teach them better. This house holds no place for me now. Let it echo until you understand what you removed. There was no rage in those words, only finality. A clean break, written in ink. Later that evening, as snow drifted across the lake, I sat alone on the bench near the cabin dock. My scarf wrapped tightly at the neck, fingers curled around a warm mug. No regrets, no bitterness, only quiet. Somewhere behind me, lights flickered from the cabin windows. Inside were women reading Resting Healing. I used to think being forgotten was the worst fate. But I was never forgotten. I was erased. And now I had rewritten myself. If you've ever been pushed aside by those you once gave everything to, I see you. This story isn't about revenge. It's about release, about choosing to build something in the silence they left behind. If a part of this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to know that their worth isn't tied to being needed. Sometimes, stepping away is not giving up. It's finally stepping into the life you were meant to live.